Chapter 61, Classic Rethinking, Bartok and the Neoclassical Turn. Let's go and just quickly do a little bit of whiteboard work, right? This is about neoclassicism and early music in the 20th century. So remember, we talk about the Romantic period, 1800 to 1900. And do you remember the favorite music of the Romantic period? Right? Well, it was about program music, about the supernatural and the macabre, spooky stuff, about nature, right? These times of things of the Romantic period. And then in the 1900, we say 1900 to 1945 is early modernism. And then we say 1945 to present, right, is, I don't know what they call it. But we say that 20th century and beyond is 1900 to present, but we break it down into before World War II and between World War I and World War II. Okay, let's go to the PowerPoint. Okay, chapter 61. So it tells us here 20th century composers used more authentic folk and traditional elements in their nationalistic music than 19th century composers did. Remember about nationalism. We say it's about some element of your country, not necessarily that it's patriotism, but it's relative to your culture and your country. Hungarian composer Bela Bartok. We're going to look about his music. He's an important composer that's often overlooked. Collected traditional songs and dances from his native land of Hungary and incorporated elements from them into his compositions. This is important because Hungarian music is different than German music, their native music, and it's certainly different than Spanish music. Bartok's music displays new scales and rhythmic ideas and modern polytonal harmonic language. And we'll hear this music from Hungary and Bulgaria, and then it kind of explains, well, this is what his roots are, and so naturally he would be using polytonal harmonic language. All set in classical forms. We'll talk about what neoclassicism is. In his programmatic concerto for orchestra, the whole ensemble is the soloist. So it's really in concerto grosso, and it says it's programmatic. And I don't know if you noticed, but initially I had this piece of music under our swing through program music. But then I examined it closer and I said, no, this is not really program music. It's absolute music, and it's a better example of absolute music. And remember, when you put things in genre, they can be members of two different genres at the same time, right? We'd like to say a movie is a movie, but it could be a documentary and it could be a black and white documentary. So anyway, you could have the same work of art that's in different genre. So the concerto for orchestra, there's the fourth movement, which we can listen. You could say is somewhat programmatic, but I don't think the piece of music is a program. The piece of music is program music. So here shows a map of Europe in 1923, just after World War I. And of course, it would stay like this until World War II. There was no Poland before World War I, at least for about 100 or 200 years. It had been eliminated, and it was after World War I, they drew the lines and said, okay, it's Poland. But notice, East Germany and West Germany are not together. right? And this is Russia that the czars took over in a revolution, or the revolution was taken over from the czars, which were the kings, basically. And here we have Austria and Hungary, and there's Vienna, remember our important sister city. But Bartok is from Hungary. And just as Spain is so different from the rest of the Moors because it's occupation for 500 years by the Moors, right? The Arabs changed to music and olive art. And if you listen to flamenco music, it really is that gypsy music. And you can hear that Arabic influence the strongest, I believe, in the Spanish flamenco music, which is from southern Spain. But of course, this is all part of the Roman Empire. Then the Arabs take over all of this, and Turkey, the Ottoman Empire. And here is Constantine, right? This is where Emperor Constantine, and in like 300, the Roman, he left and he took a good military part with him. And some say that this is part of the reason that, or one of the many reasons that Rome fell, right? And we use the year 476. So Christianity was started by Constantine. Well, no, it wasn't started. He allowed it to exist after 313, but he left and he became a Christian. And the city over here was named after him, Constantinople. And actually, he made that city. He built that city, and now it's called Istanbul. And it was Constantinople until 1453, when that fell, and the Arabs, the Ottomans, had been trying to take it for years, and finally they did, and this caused a movement of people to leave from here to go over there, which encouraged the Renaissance. But these people moved into here, and it changed this part of Europe forever, just like Spain was changed forever. And we'll notice that when we sample some of the folk music from Bulgaria. It's pretty crazy stuff. So just to show you, right, in the spring of 1529, remember Bach wasn't born until 1685, and we say the invention of opera is 1600. So here the Ottoman Empire is occupying Bulgaria. And the thing to remember is the Danube River, I think, comes out right here. So they frequently invaded by boat up the river. I'm not sure exactly. Where's Vienna? Austria, Vienna, the Danube River goes here. Anyway, they went from here all the way up to Vienna, we'll see, right? 120,000, 300,000 men invading and occupying southeastern Europe there. And the Battle of Vienna took place in 1683, 2 years before the time Bach was born. And this was finally stopped the Ottoman Empire from invading the rest of Europe. Right? Here we are in Vienna, we're talking about. Wow. Okay, so kind of a little background of why that southeastern Europe has a different culture, and we'll sample it in a few minutes. So what is neoclassicism? Because we talk about it, we say that Bartok is neoclassicism. And here we're talking about the music that is between World War I and World War II. And this is probably a better slide to start with here, right? And so it's an approach to music with a scientific spirit, right? And they used authentic folk music and traditional elements. Ethnomusicologist, right? There's a term called musicologist, which is a highly upper degree type in music. I don't think you can get a bachelor's degree in musicology, and usually your PhDs and things like that, where when you study music, you're not just interested in the music, but you want to know how they played it and who they played it for and where they played it and what time of the day did they play it, what kind of strings did they have on the instruments, these kinds of things that really want to make it and find out exactly what happened. Ethnomusicology, and the word is ethnic, right? And so this is the same thing where an ethnomusicologist studies the music of certain peoples throughout the world and does that same attitude of trying to figure it out as a musicologist, because then they're an ethnomusicologist. And the question is, what is neoclassicism? Because we say this is popular between World War I and World War II. Well, neoclassicism is really kind of like, and I should have a picture here of, we talked before when we talk about classical music, the buildings in the United States that have those pillars, like the Supreme Court and the Capitol building and the domes. And so this classical architecture, we say classical meaning from the Greeks and the Romans. And so this is an attitude when we say neoclassicism, it's that attitude about the pillars and the shapes and things, right? So what does it mean? Is that the music in neoclassicism is about absolute music, not about program music. And the music was focused on the attention on craftsmanship and balance, not just wild creativity, right? Classical virtues of objectivity and control, but also including ideals of progress through science, right? This scientific attitude from the 20th century, and an attitude of something about the formality of it, the form, right, above the expressive. So we really look at it and we say the classical period is about the form, and the Romantic period is about the expressive, and now we're kind of going back to this attitude about the form again. So here, the neoclassicism strove for purity of line and proportion, and they revived these pieces of music, and you can say, well, that's Baroque music. Yeah, but they're looking at the form, right? What is it, the toccata, fugue? We listen to Bach fugue and how it's all organized with the subjects and how it's presented. And the same thing with the concerto grosso they use here, right? Well, we're going to sample Bartók's Concerto for Orchestra, which is really a concerto grosso, and these other forms that are Baroque pieces of music, but as well, remember we talked about the multi-movement forms of symphony, sonata, and concerto. So this is also the focus of neoclassicism. And they looked at these composers of Bach, Handel, and Vivaldi, not because they're the Baroque, but because of their attitude in the form and the structure of the music. There really is no art movement, like for painting, that you could say is 20th century neoclassical. It really doesn't exist. I've looked for it, and it just doesn't exist. But they're showing his painter Marc Chagall. He fled occupied France for America in 1941 and painted this, The War, that's what this is called, right? Just 2 years later. And I don't know if you would call this neoclassicism. It's more like surrealism, right? Things that are not real. But obviously there's elements of war here and destruction. So composers are not always locked into one style, right? Because here they're saying about English Benjamin Britten, and we're going to sample his music, which is the first listening guide in the book. We haven't listened to it yet, but we will shortly, and it's called The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra from 1946, and I would say it's definitely neoclassical. Later, after World War II, Benjamin Britten is more a romantic composer, and he's writing operas and things that are very expressive, and so it's not neoclassical. But his Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra is a good example of neoclassical music. And then composers like Sergio Prokofiev and Shostakovich as well wrote romantic and neoclassical music. But both of these guys were Russian. And at the time, all of the music had to be approved by a committee before it could be released and performed at all. And they were paid by the government. This is the way communism worked. They paid you, and then they expect you to do things their way, right? The party way. Shostakovich, I've read stories about his being a genius as much as Mozart, and the capabilities with music that he had were evidence of him being a genius. And there's stories that Shostakovich talks about getting phone calls from Joseph Stalin himself. Joseph Stalin murdered more people than Hitler did, right? And most of them were Russians. So people were deathly afraid of Stalin, and Shostakovich became internationally famous, but he has also got those phone calls from Joseph Stalin and his music had to be approved. So naturally, his music is neoclassical. He couldn't do whatever he wanted. He had to have his music be approved. So now Bela Bartok, right? Bartok, and the Eastern European tradition. So he was a virtuoso pianist. He was an ethnomusicologist. Of course, when you hear things, it's going to affect you forever, and that's his roots. So he's from Hungary. He toured these villages with another composer, Zoltan Kodály, and he collected over 2,000 folk songs, and we're going to sample some of these in a minute. But in World War II, actually, I think in 1940, maybe it was 1940, that Hungary was an ally with Nazi Germany, and Bartok left because of fear, right? Can you imagine just having to leave your country because of politics and government? Anyway, he moved to New York City in 1940, and I think we'll come back to that here. So he's considered to be a rhythmic innovator, pounding rhythm, syncopation, changing meters, ostinatos, modern dissonant counterpoints, paltonalities, and all of his music does not exhibit those all at the same time, right? So adherence to classical forms, like we said. So he wrote orchestral music, he wrote 5 concertos, he wrote string quartets, 6 very famous string quartets, a lot of piano music that students play, and vocal music. So his concerto for orchestra, remember he moved to New York City in 1940, but shortly after he got sick and had leukemia, and he was in a hospital in Boston, and famous conductor from the Boston Orchestra went to visit him, and Bartok was poor and didn't have money, and so he wouldn't accept money. This is the attitude of a lot of Europeans, and but the conductor said, "I want to hire you to write some music," and he did, and he paid him and helped him out with the money, and then it motivated Bartok to get well. Okay, so anyway, the concerto for orchestra. And you kind of say, well, concerto is for solo instrument and orchestra, and that typically is the case. But if you go back to the Baroque period, one of the concerto styles was called concerto grosso, where you have different groups of the orchestra focused as time passes, and that's what this orchestra, concerto for orchestra, does do. Typically we say a concerto has 3 movements. This one has 5 movements. They talk about it being somewhat programmatic, and I think I can read a part of the section here on 4, that because there's 5 parts, right? Here's Bela Bartok. This is Bartok showing him as an ethnomusicologist. So what would he do? He'd go out and he'd go to a village and you say, who is your one that sings at your parties, at your festivals, at your special moments? Who comes and sings? Well, it's this lady. So you go and ask her, come and sing me some songs. She says, how many songs do you know? She says, well, I don't know, 30, 50, 100. Sing me some songs. And you record it. So here's a recording device at the time. You would sing and the sound would go through this megaphone and be written down to something that was able to remember the mark. Right? This is analog recording. And then you play it back doing the same thing. So it goes to a needle and makes a mark, usually in some kind of like beeswax or something, on a cylinder. Okay, we'll come to this programmatic element about it in a minute here. I want to play you a piece of music from Bulgaria, right? It's a song. That's pretty unique type of music, right? Here is another example of music from Bulgaria. That is just so unique music. And if you can't hear an Arab influence in that, then you're not listening closely. I don't think so. But I do hear that same root or connection between the flamenco music in Spain with that dissonance and that cry, that pain, and the warbling part, right? The tremolo. So there's a connection between the flamenco music and that music. I think there is, and because they come from the same roots of the Romans and the Arabs. Okay. Anyway, so let's listen to this example by from the textbook, and it's from the Concerto for Orchestra, and it's the fourth movement. Here is what Bartók had to say that makes it a programmatic piece. He says, the artist declares his love for his native land in a serenade, which is suddenly interrupted in a crude and violent manner. He is seized by rough, booted men who even break his instrument. So, does that make it the whole piece of music, program music? I don't necessarily so. No, but anyway, it says it's a music portrayal of 1942 Nazi invasion of Russia. I think that's a stretch. But does it have these folk-like things in it? Yes. Okay, let's listen to the movement, fourth movement. Okay, that is the fourth movement, right? Remember, it's 5 movements altogether. But this music is very entertaining. It's very accessible. It's full of humor and wit, and it's neoclassical music. There's a lot of dissonance, but it's in a very um, um, entertaining way. Here's some other words we could say. That does it have objectivity and control? Right? I would think so. Does it have proportion and balance? I would say so. Right? And so this is definitely neoclassical music. Now, I'm going to play a little example of some Bartok music that is not necessarily accessible. It's hard to hear. And his 6-string quartets are are far out as far as their accessibility. Here, check out a little bit of one of his string quartets. This is a good example of his string quartets. But does it have purity of line and proportion and the organization, the restraint like a fugue or toccata? Yes, it does. So it's not that accessible to our ears, but is definitely very structured, organized, and it's neoclassical music in 20th century harmonies. Okay, this is another piece of music, just a little bit of it, that's kind of in between the concerto for orchestra and the string quartets. It's called For Music for Strings, Percussion, and Celesta, and some say this is one of his best pieces of music. That, let's say, is the conclusion of chapter 61 on neoclassical music between World War I and World War II.